If scientists fed every surviving ancient Egyptian construction text into Grok, and the AI told them the granite in the pyramids was cut using a method that copper chisels physically cannot produce, would you believe it? Probably not. Most people wouldn't. But here's the problem. The evidence for that conclusion isn't coming from the AI. The evidence has been sitting in museum collections since the 1880s, documented, measured, and quietly ignored by mainstream archaeology for over 100 years. A few weeks ago, researchers fed the ancient hieroglyphic records describing Egyptian stone cutting into Grok, XAI's large language model, and asked it one thing: what do these texts actually describe as the method, not what we assume they mean? What do the words say? What came back didn't describe chisels. It didn't describe pounding stones. The language the AI flagged as a category used in other Egyptian texts for directed force, focused application, something that acts on stone without mechanical contact. And when the team connected that reading to the physical evidence already documented in the artifacts, drill holes that cut through granite 500 times faster than modern diamond-tipped equipment, the implication was something nobody in the field has been willing to say out loud. The tools that cut this stone don't exist in the archaeological record, because the people who use them may not have been the people we think they were. I'm Dr. James Mercer. This just came in. Let's get into it. Here's the central question, and it's been sitting unanswered for 150 years of Egyptology. How did ancient Egyptians cut granite? Not move it, not stack it, cut it to tolerances of a fraction of a millimeter on surfaces measuring multiple meters across, thousands of times, without, according to the mainstream explanation, anything harder than copper. Copper, a metal softer than the stone it was supposedly used to cut. The official answer has never been satisfying, and the physical evidence left behind in the artifacts says it's wrong. A language model just confirmed what the artifacts have been showing us all along, and added something the artifacts couldn't tell us on their own. A description, in the builder's own words, of what they were actually using. What does the AI say the hieroglyphs actually describe? Why does the precision of the granite cutting exceed what any known ancient tool can produce? Why do drill holes in Egyptian granite artifacts show a cutting speed 500 times faster than modern diamond drills? And why, when an engineer published those measurements in the 1980s, did mainstream Egyptology simply not respond? We're going to walk through all of it. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. This is the kind of finding that gets buried, and I want you to see it before it does. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what granite actually is and what it means to cut it. Granite is one of the hardest naturally occurring stones on Earth. On the Mohs hardness scale, the standard measure of how resistant a material is to being scratched, granite sits between 6 and 7. For comparison, copper sits between 2.5 and 3. A copper tool dragged across a granite surface doesn't cut the granite. The granite cuts the copper. This is not a contested fact. It is basic materials science, and it is the central problem at the heart of Egyptian archaeology that nobody in the mainstream has ever resolved. The pyramids at Giza, the temples at Karnak, the obelisks at Luxor, all of them involve granite cut, shaped, and polished to standards of precision that are not casual. The granite coffer inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid has interior surfaces flat to within 0.02 of an inch across several meters. That's 0.05 of a millimeter. Modern precision engineers, using CNC machinery with computer-controlled tolerances, can replicate that accuracy barely and with great difficulty. The ancient Egyptians allegedly did it with copper chisels and dolerite pounding stones. Dolerite is harder than granite, so the pounding story has some logic. You can, with patience, abrade granite using a harder stone. But abrasion doesn't explain the precision. It doesn't explain the internal corners cut at perfect right angles. It doesn't explain the drill holes. And it doesn't explain what the artifacts themselves reveal when you actually measure them. In the 1880s, the British archaeologist William Flinders Petrie made systematic measurements of Egyptian granite artifacts in the Petrie Museum collection. He was one of the most rigorous field archaeologists of his era. And what he found in those measurements was something he described in his published work, clearly and without sensationalism, as requiring a tool that left marks consistent with a tubular drill cutting at a rate that implied enormous downward pressure and a cutting speed he could not account for. He published this in 1883. Nobody followed up. The reason Petrie's findings didn't change anything is the same reason that inconvenient data never changes anything in this field. The framework was already set. By the time Petrie published his measurements, Egyptology had already decided what ancient Egyptians could and couldn't do. The civilization was impressive, yes, monumental certainly, but it operated within the bounds of what Stone Age and Bronze Age technology permitted. That was the consensus, and Petrie's drill hole measurements, which implied a cutting speed and pressure impossible to explain within that consensus, were filed away as an interesting anomaly and left there. A century later, in 1984, an engineer named Christopher Dunn picked up where Petrie left off. Dunn was not an archaeologist. He was a manufacturing engineer with decades of experience in precision machining. He looked at the same drill holes Petrie had measured and analyzed them the way an engineer analyzes tool marks. What he found was specific. The spiral groove left by the drill in the granite, the mark the cutting edge leaves as it rotates, had a feed rate, meaning the rate at which the drill advanced into the stone per revolution, of approximately 0.1 inches per revolution. Modern diamond-tipped core drills cutting through granite advance at approximately 0.002 inches per revolution. The ancient drill was cutting 500 times faster than the best modern equivalent into one of the hardest stones on Earth, with a tool nobody has ever found in the archaeological record. Dunn published this in a specialist engineering journal. Egyptology did not respond, not to dispute it, not to explain it, not to investigate further. The findings sat in the literature, cited occasionally and otherwise ignored. And the question it raised, what was that tool, remained, as far as the mainstream was concerned, not worth asking. Then, recently, a research team decided to stop waiting for archaeology to ask the question and ask the AI instead. They gathered the ancient Egyptian textual sources that describe construction and stoneworking, sections of the pyramid texts, the Turin papyrus fragments relating to construction, hieroglyphic inscriptions from the workers' village at Giza, and the decorative reliefs at the Temple of Dendera that mainstream scholars had long classified as religious imagery. They fed all of it into Grok with a single instruction: analyze the language describing stone cutting and tell me what category of action these words belong to. The AI came back with something specific. The hieroglyphic terms used in these texts for what happens to stone during construction don't map cleanly onto the vocabulary of mechanical striking or abrasion. In Egyptian writing, there are clear, well-established terms for hitting, pounding, and scraping. Those terms appear frequently in other contexts. They do not dominate the stone-cutting passages. What the AI flagged instead was a cluster of language it categorized as directional application. Terms that in other Egyptian texts describe the action of the sun's heat on a surface, the movement of sound through air, or the focused projection of divine force. Not contact, not percussion. Something directed at the stone from a source. And the anchor detail that stopped the team cold. The AI identified that this same category of language appears in the Dendera reliefs, the carvings that show what appear to be elongated, bulb-like objects sitting on columns connected by cables with figures standing beside them. The mainstream interpretation is religious symbolism. The AI flagged the accompanying text as describing a process of stone modification using directed emission. In other words, the carvings that look like electrical discharge lamps are, according to the AI's reading of the accompanying text, described as construction tools. That is not a fringe interpretation. That is what the words say. As the team kept pulling the thread, the picture didn't narrow. It widened. The first revelation, the Inventory Stele. In 1858, French archaeologist Auguste Mariette excavated a limestone stele at Giza and found an inscription that described the Sphinx and the pyramids as already existing when the pharaoh Khufu arrived on the plateau. The stele credits their construction not to any pharaoh but to the Neteru, a term usually translated as gods, but which in context describes beings who preceded human civilization and established it. According to this inscription, the pyramids weren't built by Egyptians. They were inherited by them. Mainstream Egyptology rejected the stele as a later forgery, but it was excavated in valid archaeological context by one of the most credentialed archaeologists of his era. The reason given for rejecting it was that its claims contradicted the established timeline, not that the physical evidence was wrong, that the conclusion was unacceptable. The second revelation, the precision comparison. The King's Chamber coffer is not the only piece of granite at Giza with impossible tolerances. The casing stones of the pyramid, the outer limestone blocks that have mostly been stripped, were measured by Petrie at a gap of 5/100ths of an inch between adjacent stones across surfaces several meters long, with cement between them. The cement fills a gap so thin you cannot reliably cut it with modern masonry equipment. And there are over 100,000 of those joints in the pyramid, each one of them 5/100ths of an inch, over 100,000 times. The third revelation. When the team looked at the Dendera reliefs again through the AI's interpretation, they found something the standard religious reading had always smoothed over. The objects in the carvings are not floating. They are connected. Cables run from each bulb-like form to a larger object described in the accompanying text using the same directional emission language flagged earlier. Whatever these are depicting, they are depicted as a system, connected components, a functioning apparatus, not symbols, schematics. And here's what makes this impossible to write off as an Egyptian anomaly. The same precision, the same impossible tolerances, the same absence of adequate tools in the archaeological record. It shows up on the other side of the planet. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, granite and andesite blocks weighing up to 800 tons were cut with H-shaped precision interlocking joints. The tolerances are identical to the Egyptian granite. Surfaces flat to fractions of a millimeter, internal corners cut at perfect right angles. The civilization that built it left no writing, no tools that could account for the cuts, and no explanation. Mainstream archaeology dates the site to around 500 AD but cannot explain the construction. At Machu Picchu in Peru, the Inca cut granite blocks that fit together so precisely that after 500 years, through multiple major earthquakes, the joints haven't shifted. A razor blade cannot be inserted between the stones. The Inca had no iron tools. The cuts are smoother and more precise than what their known technology could produce. On Easter Island, the Moai statues were carved from basalt, another extremely hard volcanic rock, using coral and obsidian tools, according to the mainstream explanation. Independent materials testing has raised serious questions about whether those tools could have produced the surface finishes actually found on the statues. 4 separate sites, 4 continents, 4 civilizations, with no documented contact, all cutting stone to tolerances that exceed their known technology, all leaving behind no tool that can account for what they made. And in each case, the local tradition, the stories these civilizations told about who built these things, consistently describes the builders as beings who preceded ordinary humans. The Neteru in Egypt, the Viracocha in South America, beings who came, built, taught, and left. 4 separate traditions, 4 separate locations, 1 story. Here's what the critics of this evidence never address. Dunn's feed rate measurements have been in the published literature since 1984, 40 years. In those 40 years, no mainstream Egyptologist has published a paper explaining what tool produced a feed rate 500 times faster than modern diamond drilling. Not a refutation, not an alternative, not a proposed experiment, nothing. When you don't have an answer, the standard scientific move is to investigate, to design a test, to say, here is the anomaly, here is our hypothesis for explaining it, here is how we'll verify it. That is how science works. That has not happened. The anomaly has been acknowledged by the people who can't ignore the measurements classified as interesting and move past, because the only explanations that fit the physical evidence require accepting something that the field is not prepared to accept. The Dendera reliefs have a similar history. They've been studied, photographed, and discussed in academic literature since the 19th century. The resemblance of the carved objects to electrical discharge equipment was noted publicly by researchers in the 1960s. The standard response from mainstream archaeology has been to call the interpretation unscientific, without publishing a line-by-line engagement with what the accompanying text actually says. Now an AI has read that text, and it didn't read it as a religious scholar. It read it as a language model analyzing semantic categories, and it categorized the construction descriptions as directional emission language, the same category as heat, sound, and directed force, independently of any human interpreter's assumptions. That reading is now documented. It exists. And the question it raises, whether the Dendera reliefs are depicting a construction technology, not a religious myth, is one that mainstream archaeology is going to have to eventually address, or bury, the way they've buried everything else. So here's where this leaves us. Granite was cut in ancient Egypt to tolerances that copper tools cannot produce. The drill holes show a cutting speed 500 times faster than the best modern equipment. The hieroglyphic texts describing construction use language the AI categorizes as directed emission, not mechanical impact. The Dendera reliefs appear to show a connected apparatus the accompanying text describes with the same directional language. The Inventory Stele says the pyramids were built before the pharaohs, and 4 completely unrelated ancient civilizations on 4 continents all achieved the same impossible precision with the same absence of adequate tools, all while their traditions describe the builders as beings who preceded ordinary humanity. Put all of that together, and the mainstream explanation, thousands of workers, copper chisels, dolerite pounders, brute force, and patience, doesn't just fall short. It doesn't explain a single one of those data points. So who did build it? The Egyptian texts say the Neteru, beings who came before, who established civilization and then left. The South American traditions say the Viracocha, the same story. Builders who preceded humans, who had knowledge humans didn't, and who, at some point, were gone. The AI's reading of the hieroglyphs doesn't answer that question directly, but it does answer the tool question. And the tool it describes, something that acts on stone through directed force without contact, producing the precision found in the artifacts, is not in any Bronze Age toolkit. It's not in any Stone Age toolkit. It is not in any toolkit that has ever been found associated with human civilization at any point in history, which means either the tool was removed before we started looking, or the people who used it were not the people we've been crediting with the work. And that second possibility is the one the Inventory Stele has been trying to tell us since 1858, the one the feed rate measurements have been showing us since 1883, and the one the AI just put into language that's very hard to dismiss, is exactly what the next piece of evidence answers. And it comes from a source nobody expected. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because when that one goes up, you're going to want to have seen this one first. I'm Dr. James Mercer. The moment I have more, you'll be the first to know.